Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Blue Green Action Platform. My name is Rose Santana, and today we will be asking the question, what is nitrogen and why do we care? So first, let's ask the question, what is nitrogen? Nitrogen is a chemical element with the symbol N and the atomic number 7. It is a colorless, odorless, and tasteless gas. It is the most plentiful element in Earth's atmosphere, and it is a constituent of all living matter. In fact, nitrogen is everywhere. It's in the soil in our gardens, it's in the water we drink, and it's in the air that we breathe. In fact, nitrogen is the most abundant element in Earth's atmosphere. Approximately 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So, to say that nitrogen is important to all living things on this planet is a vast understatement. Now, one of the reasons why nitrogen is so important is because it plays a key role in plant growth. Now, as we all know, plants are vital to our existence on this planet, both to humans, animals, and the atmosphere in general. Without enough nitrogen, plants cannot thrive, leading to low or bad crops, but too much nitrogen can be toxic to plants. Nitrogen is necessary for our food supply, but excess nitrogen can harm the environment. I don't know if you guys have ever heard the saying, the dose makes the poison, but in this case, that's really true. Great. Now we know what nitrogen is, but what does it do? Great question. Well, nitrogen is an essential nutrient for the production of amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids such as DNA and RNA. Now, these are the most important of all biological molecules and crucial for all living things because DNA carries the genetic blueprint for each life form. Well, what happens when there's not enough nitrogen? A lack of nitrogen can inhibit the production of amino acids, which are substances that make up living cells, muscles, and tissues. So they're kind of a big deal. Without amino acids, plants cannot make the special proteins that the plant cells need to grow. With too much nitrogen, plants produce excess biomass or organic matter, which are things such as branches, stalks, and leaves, but not enough root structure, which is important to stabilize plants and allow for important uptakes such as water and nutrient uptake. In fact, in some extreme cases, plants with very high levels of nitrogen can be poisonous to animals that eat them. So it's really important for us to watch out what the nitrogen concentration is in our food. In fact, if you're a home gardener like me, you might notice some of your plants, especially like tomato plants or pepper plants, that will produce a lot of leaves and a lot of foliage, but you don't actually get any fruit or produce. And most of the times it's because there's too much nitrogen in your fertilizers. So, pro tip for you guys. Okay, so now we know what nitrogen is and what nitrogen does. If we're going to talk about nitrogen, we need to talk about the nitrogen cycle. Well, Rose, what the heck is the nitrogen cycle? I'm so glad you asked. The nitrogen cycle is a constantly repeating cycle during which nitrogen moves through both living and non-living things, the atmosphere, soil, water, plants, animals, and bacteria. Now, there are 5 different stages of the nitrogen cycle, so let's talk a little bit more about them in just a second. But just so you know, nitrogen must change forms to move through the cycle, so it never remains the same. And I'm going to show you guys a picture of the nitrogen cycle as it happens on terrestrial ecosystems. The process of the nitrogen cycle occurs the exact same way in marine ecosystems as it does in terrestrial systems. The only difference is that in marine ecosystems, it's carried out by marine bacteria instead of terrestrial. Simple, huh? Now on to the stages. So typically, it starts with stage 1, which is nitrogen fixation. In this stage, nitrogen moves from the atmosphere into the soil. Fixation converts nitrogen in the atmosphere into forms that plants can absorb through their root systems, and this process typically includes bacteria in the soil. Stage 2 is mineralization. This stage takes place in the soil. Nitrogen moves from organic materials such as manure or plant materials to an inorganic form of nitrogen that plants can use. Step 3, nitrification. Nitrification also occurs in the soils, and during nitrification, the ammonia in the soils produced during stage 2 mineralization is converted into compounds called nitrites and nitrates, the latter which can be used by plants and animals. Now, fun fact for you guys, if any of you guys have a home aquarium or, a fish tank, you would be familiar with this process because the nitrogen cycle is super important for cycling your tank and making sure that it's adequate to house your animals. So, yeah. Stage 4 is the immobilization cycle. And this cycle is super important because it helps control and balance the amount of nitrogen in the soils, and it tries to reduce the amount of excess nitrogen we have. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about why excess nitrogen is so dangerous a little bit later, but keep that in mind. And stage 5 is denitrification. In the 5th stage of the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen returns to the air as nitrates are converted to atmospheric nitrogen. So basically, it's going straight back where it came from, and the cycle starts all over again. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that was a lot of information to take in. So let's just take a moment to digest it all. And now we're going to talk about why do we care, and measuring nitrogen. Why is it important, and why is it something that, we need to stay on top of? So typically, a couple of the more common places where nitrogen is measured include soil, wastewater, and the food industry. So for water, samples are taken for analysis and reported in units of micrograms per liter or parts per billion. Soil samples are taken and measured in milligrams of nitrogen per kilogram of soil, so mg/kg, and is also known as a potentially mineralizable nitrogen. So how do you actually measure nitrogen levels? So the most common one is the total Kjeldahl nitrogen standard. It is a commonly used and prescribed standard for nitrogen measurements in many industries, and it measures the combined level of organic nitrogen, nitrogen in ammonia, and ammonium. So in the food industry, for example, nitrogen testing helps determine the quality of protein in food for quality control and labeling purposes, which we all know are super important. And many wastewater treatment plants will also check nitrogen levels in the water for discharge. And this is typically to avoid having excess nitrogen in our waterways. And that's a whole nother topic that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And typically there are international standards used to regulate nitrogen discharge, just because we don't want one country dumping out a bunch of nitrogen while another doesn't. And even though these are things that affect us globally, right? So there needs to be sort of an international standard for what's adequate. And that's usually done or accomplished by thorough research. Now, part of the reason why measuring nitrogen is so important, because excess nitrogen can be detrimental to our ecosystems. They can lead to a process known as eutrophication, which can in turn lead to harmful algal blooms, which can cause fish kills and can impact human health. In fact, this right here is a prime example of a blue-green algal bloom happening in a freshwater body. So in fact, you've probably heard of red tide, right? It's usually in the news. Usually people get sick. Well, it's a type of harmful algal bloom, and red tide typically happens in our marine ecosystems versus our freshwater ecosystems. But we'll talk more about this process in our next video, so make sure to tune in to learn all about the good and the bad of nitrogen, where we'll be going over eutrophication, harmful algal blooms, why they happen, how you can spot them, and how we can prevent them. But on that note, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. We're happy to share more resources with you guys if you'd like. And a big, big, big thank you to NSF, or the National Science Foundation, Black and Marine Science, and the Glue Gap Project for helping spread environmental awareness to all of our communities. Until next time, guys, stay safe and stay active. Bye.